fortunate tonight to have Angela Wooded. She is been working in financial aid for nearly 20 years. She's been with us, presenting for us for the last 4 or 5 years. I think this might be 5th year. She spent the last 9 years working at Seattle University. She enjoys assisting students with all aspects of financial aid and the whole process, and especially looks forward to connecting with families in our community during these kinds of outreach events. So we're very fortunate to have her tonight. I'm going to turn this over to Molly Smith, one of the other counselors in our department, briefly, and she'll give you kind of some of the nuts and bolts of the evening, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Sounds great. Thank you, Susie. And thank you again, Angela, for, helping us out this year. I see more and more people streaming in, which is great. We are recording, and this will be out in maybe a week for if you want to view it again or you missed anything. This is a webinar. So if you are attending right now, we can't see you. You can't speak to us through video and audio. We do have a Q&A. If you look at the bottom panel of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So if you have questions or even if you have concerns that come up, please put them in there and we can address them if needed on the go or questions at the end. So happy to see you. So glad that we get to do this. Susie and I are gonna mute ourselves and turn our video off so we can all focus our attention on Angela.
Great. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. As Susie and Molly so welcomingly got me started here. My name is Angela Wootig. I'm a financial aid counselor at Seattle University, and I'm going to jump in and share some information that I think is going to be helpful, whether you're a seasoned financial aid recipient with other, possibly other siblings already in school, or this is some of the first information that you're receiving. So let me just jump in. So just one moment while I share my screen here. Of course, this always takes a moment. Sorry about that. Here we go. All right. So once again, welcome. As everyone knows from the introduction, I do work at Seattle U, and what I think you'll find out from this webinar is, a lot of basics about financial aid, where to start, and how to think about all the different types of aid that you might be eligible to receive. I think the other thing that's important, although clearly I've worked at Seattle U, I've been at a few other institutions, and although you'll see some of our logos and so on and so forth, this information should be really helpful no matter what schools you're considering. So we try to make it all inclusive, so it's helpful to everyone attending tonight. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to try to keep this as informal as we can, but get to all the information that might be really helpful. So of course, those things, that we get questions about most often are understanding costs, what students pay, and then clearly how to apply for financial aid and covering those costs. So we'll break it down and kind of move through the program tonight in all of these different topics. So first and foremost, the most important thing to understand is the cost of going to college or university. And that's going to be the same no matter what university you're considering. You're always going to have your direct costs. So clearly those are things like tuition and fees. And if you're living on campus, housing and food, those things in most cases are charged directly through the university that you're attending. But when you're considering your educational expenses, you also have to think about your indirect costs. costs. So those are things like books and supplies or transportation expenses, personal expenses, all these other documented educational expenses. And clearly those can vary from school to school. If you're looking at a local school versus maybe, flying across the country, those are all just things to think about when you're budgeting for your education. So this is an equation that you'll want to consider, direct cost plus indirect cost equals your total cost of attendance. We'll talk a little bit more about the total cost of attendance and why that's important and how that is used in determining your financial aid eligibility. But we just want to make sure that you understand those general principles first. So from here, how much does college cost? That's a very good question that is on everyone's mind. And you'll see that each institution you apply for will, assess their own charges for tuition and fees, just like I mentioned. That would be charged on like what, most schools will call your student account. In order to determine what those costs look like, those are essentially three different things that you're going to need to consider. So the type of school you're looking at, whether it's like a community college, a state college, or a private university, and then clearly your location and whether you're a resident of that state, and then your individual financial aid eligibility. And again, we're trying to just build upon these different concepts, and we'll go in much more depth about applying for financial aid and all of those pieces a little bit later on. So we talked about three different types of college or university that you might be considering. And we just wanted to, be as helpful as we can to give you a good sense of what these costs might look like. So for instance, three very well-known local institutions. So if you're looking at a community college like Seattle Central, you'll see when you're comparing the different costs side by side. And again, these are costs that are published on all of these universities' websites. These are all the costs that are published for this current academic year. Most universities will not have their costs published for next year just yet, just based on, the academic year and the fiscal year and all that fun stuff that happens behind the scenes. But you'll see right away that a community college has two different prices, a price for a resident and a cost for a non-resident. And that's much the same for a state school like the University of Washington. And you'll see that those costs are very different depending if you are a resident or not. And then the third flavor, a private university like Seattle University, you will see that the cost is the same for a resident versus non-resident because a private university like Seattle U, we're not getting that like subsidized funding from the state of Washington. And that's why that amount just remains the same. So it's a good thing to consider. And when you first see these numbers, it can be a little bit intimidating that, that if you are looking at schools within the state of Washington, you see a big difference there. We want to highlight this first, not to, make anyone nervous about considering a private school, but we want to move right along to the next question. You're asking, what am I paying for? Why is it so different for the different schools? So let's talk about that a little bit. So this is all of our direct costs at Seattle U. So we really just want to be as transparent as we can to show you why our costs are so high. So the tuition, again, for full-time enrollment, which is 12 or more credits, does break down to around $53,000 a year. The wellness fees, all of these things are standard fees that you'll see in our cost of attendance if you were to attend Seattle U. I think you'll see when you're going and speaking to any different university, their financial aid office, they should have all of this published so you can really compare the different costs side by side. And we want students and families to be as well informed as we can, both to see number one, like what those costs are, but on the flip side, to see how much financial aid may be available to you, because the piece when you first start looking at these expenses, it's for a lot of families, these are high costs. I know it would be for me, for sure. But I think what we want to demonstrate is that there can be a very generous amount of financial aid that may come into play that would, in some cases, level that playing field. So let's look at that next, okay? So, but before we talk about that, I do want to just point out the indirect costs. We talk about that a little bit. We survey our students when it comes to indirect costs. So these are the costs that normally students are paying out of pocket. So that's like books and supplies or transportation expenses or personal expenses. And clearly these can vary. Books and supplies, you know, this is a good estimate based on how we survey our students. Transportation completely depends on, you know, if you're just commuting within town, taking the bus versus flying, you know, across the country. And personal expenses, when we talk about that, you know, we're talking about the occasional pizza on Friday night, shampoo, laundry detergent, all that kind of stuff. So again, just for budgeting purposes, this can be really helpful to have these different pieces of the puzzle when you're looking at the costs and in turn, looking at your financial aid. So, of course, everyone is probably sitting there, if they're considering CLU or another private institution, and being a little apprehensive, saying like, will I pay over $70,000 a year for my education? I mean, that sounds a little rough, to be perfectly honest. So Rudy says, nope. So Rudy is our Red Hawk. He's our mascot for our sports teams. So we had to just throw him in here for a little fun. So what we want to highlight for this is students pay what we call net price, regardless of where they attend. And if there's one thing you take away with you tonight, we really, really want to make sure that we explain and that there's a good understanding of what net price means. So when we talk about net price, we're talking about the amount that the student pays after to attend an institution in a single academic year after subtracting any scholarships, grants, and any other type of financial aid that they might receive. So it's really important to focus on that net price and not the sticker price, because as you see, the sticker price for a community college versus a state school versus a private institution is very, very different. But the net price can be more similar than what you might expect, or at least what you might initially expect to see when you're comparing different schools. Again, we broke it down here a little bit more, the net price. It's all of those different things we were talking about and the cost of attendance. So your tuition, living expenses, the mandatory fees that you'll pay, and then along with any miscellaneous supplies or transportation. How you get at your net price, we'll talk a little bit more right now. So how do I cover my net costs? So that is the great next question. And the first thing that we definitely want to highlight is completing the FAFSA application. That is always for the vast majority of students and families, completing the FAFSA is the most valuable thing that you can do to see, you know, maximize the financial aid eligibility that you may have coming to you. I know Susie talked a little bit about some of the changes coming to the FAFSA. I will talk a little bit about that, but in all honesty, that is something that we'll talk a little bit more informally about during our Q&A session. So I know everyone knows that you're able to add any questions to that section, and we'll hold all of those questions for the end about the nuts and bolts of what's changing with the FAFSA and how that may impact you. But what we want to make sure that we're touching on and making sure that, you know, we provide you with is, you know, the real nuts and bolts of who can apply for the FAFSA, when, where, all of those pieces. So who is applying for the FAFSA? It's you and your contributor. And you'll see that language changed a little bit on the FAFSA. Normally it would say you and your parent if you were a dependent student, which most traditional traditional high school students coming into their undergraduate program for the first time are what we're called dependent students, which means that you would need you and your contributor on the FAFSA. And for most cases, contributor just equals your parent. Contributor, what it means in the end, and one big change for the FAFSA means that the contributor, if you are in a family where maybe your parents are in a separation or divorced, it's the parent who financially supports you the most. In the past, it was the parent you lived with the most. So that is probably the biggest striking change from last year to this year on the FAFSA. It's just something to be aware of. And, this is a good place to highlight what contributor means. So again, what is the FAFSA? The FAFSA is a financial aid application, and it's accepted at just about all colleges and universities. And you would apply for that during your senior year of high school. We'll talk a little bit more about what you can do at this point, because I bet if any of you have been involved in just, reading up on the FAFSA and financial aid, everyone knows that there are some big changes happening, which has delayed the availability of the FAFSA. We'll talk about what you can do now, though, as we move through this application and through this presentation. And then where to apply. Clearly, you want to jump on studentaid.gov. That's where the FAFSA is available. That's the federal site where you can get this all done. And why would you apply for the FAFSA? It's going to check your eligibility for every type of financial aid that you may be eligible for. So even some families who say, hey, you know what? We're very fortunate. We have a good amount of income and assets. I don't think I'm going to be eligible for quote unquote financial aid. We still highly, highly encourage all families to complete the FAFSA, because a lot of universities will not only use the FAFSA to look for state and federal financial aid. There can be institutional funding that families also cannot tap into if they don't do the FAFSA. So we strongly encourage, no matter what your financial situation is, definitely complete it, because you may be pleasantly surprised that you qualify for some funding that you didn't anticipate. So like I said, how do you know if I'm eligible to file a FAFSA? Clearly, that's the next question to ask. And it's pretty quick and easy. Essentially, you can file the FAFSA if you're a US citizen or eligible non-citizen. You have a high school diploma or the equivalency, and you're seeking a degree. It's really that straightforward at this point. So that is pretty clear cut for most students and families that it's a good idea to file the FAFSA. But then you ask, what if I'm not eligible for a FAFSA? And we say, don't panic. There are some other options as well. So if you do not qualify through those stipulations, you can still complete what's called a WASFA. So this is for Washington State residents who are not eligible to file the FAFSA. You'll see right here, the application for financial aid is accepted at Washington State schools and universities. And everything else is much the same. You complete it during your senior year of high school, and we have the web address there for you. And why you would want to apply for this is it will check eligibility for financial aid from the state of Washington. If you are a Washington State resident and you are eligible to complete the FAFSA, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but I just wanted to make sure that I highlight this. By completing the FAFSA, the federal application, it will check for your eligibility both for federal aid and for state aid. So that's comprehensive, but the WASFA is specifically for students who are not eligible to complete the FAFSA, and we highly encourage students to complete that as well. So, of course, the next question are, what are the types of financial aid that I might be eligible to receive when I complete either the FAFSA or the WASFA? So we try to give you a comprehensive list here of all the different types of financial aid that you may qualify for. in, no particular order, but of course, most students and families are asking about scholarships first. Scholarships are generally based on merit or skill, and some are need-based as well, which is why I highlighted, you want to make sure you do the FAFSA to see if you qualify for any of these need-based scholarships. Scholarships generally come from the university directly, or, there are a good number of private outside scholarships as well that might be coming from different external organizations. Scholarships, just like we highlight there, never require repayment. And we just put a couple examples at CLU. We have different merit-based scholarships. We have one called the McGoldrick Scholarship, and that's for students who are whose parents or family member are alumni from CLU. So, and then very much in the same vein, we can talk about grants. And grants are another form of financial aid that does not need to be repaid. And generally, they are coming from the federal or state government. And essentially, just like it says here, those are based on need. So like you see plenty of examples, I'm sure you've heard of some of them at least, like the federal Pell Grant or the Washington College Grant. There's also called the Washington College Bound Scholarship. So by doing either your WASFA or your FAFSA, you're going to be allowing every university that you apply to consider you for all these different types of grants and scholarships. By completing a FAFSA or a WASFA, you also may be able to qualify for educational loans. So educational loans, what we mean by that, there are a few different categories. What we primarily are processing through our office are federal loans. So, without going into too many details, the federal loans, by doing your FAFSA, we would review that, and federal loans generally that financial aid offices process are in the student's name, and that is another educational resource that students can tap into. There are also private educational loans that students can tap into, and you'll see there that we also just highlighted the fact that there can be educational loans that are available to parents as well as students. So there's, for instance, what's called a Parent Plus loan. That is another federal loan that parents can take out on top of any financial aid that a student may be receiving to help pay for that overall cost of attendance we talked about a little bit earlier in the presentation. Clearly, I think any financial aid professional that you speak with is always going to encourage you to borrow the least that you need, either as a student or as a family. But we also want to make sure that you're aware that there are these different opportunities for families to assist in paying for your education, which is why we also always like to touch on work study as another opportunity that students oftentimes take advantage of. Work study, when you see this on a student's award, you will see that it works a little bit different than all of these other types of financial aid we talked about, like scholarships, grants, loans, generally dispersed directly to your student's account to pay for those costs directly. Work study, just like it says here, it's paid as you earned. So essentially, you would get an allotment of work study, and because of qualifying for that work study funding, essentially you just are able to be a student employee, in most cases on campus. So, it very much mirrors working, in an off-campus job, at least at CLU, and in my experience at other universities as well, that you would go through an application process, get hired, submit a time card and get paid every 2 weeks. But it's just another good resource that students can tap into to assist in paying all of those costs. But the next question is, well, how do I cover my remaining costs? What happens if I apply for financial aid, even if I get a very generous package? How do I, kind of bring this all together? So what we like to talk about, I touched on some of this a little bit, but we want to make sure that you're aware, at least at CLU, and again, in my experience at most other institutions, these are the options that you'd be looking at. Most institutions will have some sort of payment plan. For instance, at CLU, what we do is if you have a remaining balance that needs to be paid, you can sign up for a payment plan that will, instead of having it be due all at once, you can set it up to be paid in monthly installments. That seems pretty standard for most institutions. So that's something you can ask about, as you're investigating different institutions. Clearly, we also strongly encourage students to apply for what we call private outside scholarships. So those are scholarships coming from outside of the university you're applying for. I talked briefly about what's called a Parent Plus loan. Again, that's another federal loan that you could use to supplement any financial aid that the student's receiving directly, and that can definitely be used to assist a student in getting your costs paid. And very much in the same way, a private educational loan would be another loan that would be in the student's name, that is separate from the FAFSA application. But again, I know I highlighted this. Again, we always encourage everyone to borrow the least, but we want to just touch on all of these items to make sure you know what all your different options are. From experience, I can also say for a lot of students and families, you can use a combination approach. So a lot of families will say, hey, maybe I can afford to pay $1,000 a month in a payment plan. I'll pay some outright, and I'll take a little bit in a loan, all depending on what that bottom line looks like. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised once you get a financial aid offer from each school. You should be able to look at all those details, see what the remaining costs would be, and then you could discuss those options with each school to see what is the best fit in the end, and what works for you and your family and your student. So what's next? Clearly, that's the next question. The next answer to that is you want to get ready to file the FAFSA. And like I said, we're going to, oops, I went a little bit faster. Sorry about that. In any case, you want to start thinking about it. And like I touched on briefly before, the FAFSA, because of all the changes to the FAFSA, which I'm going to be happy to discuss a little bit more during the Q&A if we have specific questions, but everyone knows probably at this point that it has been delayed. Normally the FAFSA is available in October. The last official notice we got from the Department of Education is that it will be open and available by December 31st. So we're hoping that the Department of Education is right on with that. So just stay posted with that. But the next thing that you can do right now is actually, let me go back once. Sorry, I had it here. So sorry for the back and forth. I thought we had one more slide, but the thing that you can do right now is to sign up and apply for what's called an FSA ID. So an FSA ID is what you're going to use to log on to your FAFSA and give consent on the FAFSA. When we say give consent, the reason we say that, one other big change to the FAFSA this year is that all students and contributors will need to use what's called IRS data retrieval. So essentially, the FAFSA will automatically pull your information from the IRS. It's really going to streamline the process. And that's one of the things that we're really looking forward to, and is going to be a great benefit to students and families, is that the form, the FAFSA, is just going to be more automatic and more dynamic, in the sense that when you enter questions, which I think we've all seen, whether you're filing taxes online or anything like that, the software behind the scenes has just gotten smarter, that it will ask you the questions that it needs, and it will skip over the questions that you don't need. But the thing that you can definitely do at this point, like I said, is to get that FSA ID ready. Just, there shouldn't be any issues. I think it's very straightforward. I've signed up for one myself, and it's should be familiar to anyone, you know, working in any field where we're doing things electronically. You'll just get that all set up. And then the other thing you can do is just start to gather your tax and income information from 2022, because the FAFSA always uses what's called your prior tax year. That way, you know, you'll have everything ready to go. And then once that is launched, yeah, then you should be good to go. Like I said, December 31st is what we're hearing. And yeah, like I said before, I'm also happy to address any other questions you might have about the updates to the FAFSA. I can say just in a conversational tone, I mean, I think the biggest things you're going to see, number one, is some of the lingo used, like any students or families that have students who are already enrolled in colleges or universities will be very familiar with a term called your EFC, or your expected family contribution. The FAFSA overhaul is kind of wiping that out. They're going to use what's called the SAI now. It's the Student Aid Index. Essentially, behind the scenes, it's going to have the same purpose. It's just going to measure a family's financial strength to determine all the different types of financial aid that you may be eligible for. And then, I mean, the nice thing is that even if you are to have to answer all of the questions on the FAFSA, there are significantly fewer questions. I made a little note here. The previous FAFSA, there was 108 questions. It's gone down to 46 questions. So it really is going to be significantly streamlined, which is great for everyone. And another great benefit is that they, in the past, you could always only list 10 colleges on your FAFSA, and they've updated that to be 20 colleges that you can list on your FAFSA if you're really considering a number of different schools and you want to send that information out. It will help you determine that, but in the end, the way you enter different schools on your FAFSA is by adding a schools. It's just called your federal school code, so you can enter even more of those and have your information sent out in that way. I think, like, in a nutshell, again, I'm happy to answer any specific questions that you may have about the FAFSA in general, or applying for financial aid, or the new overhaul of the FAFSA. You know, I can share as much as we know. I know, you know, even in aid offices, we're anxiously awaiting. There's a lot we know, and there's a lot of pieces that are still a little bit up in the air. But we're all doing our best to be as educated as we can to continue to help students and families, you know, move through this process, you know, just like we always have. So in any case, I hope this has been helpful, and I'm definitely going to open it up for questions at this point. And we can kind of go from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. We'll try to post a couple of, I know I had sent through Messenger. I sent a link to the website for to set up your ID. I also have a couple of things because a couple of the questions are which parent should set up the ID. I've got a couple of federal government cheat sheets that they've sent out. I'll try to have those links posted. One question I think that is a good one is that somebody wrote, I'm still confused, and this may be where we have to send out some information up to their own research, but
Sure.
I'm still confused about what to do about a 50-50 household split. What if it's also financially a 50-50 household split? And what if one person has been unemployed for a year and a half? Is it more beneficial to use the parent without the job? Does it matter if one parent is the power of attorney? Thank
So, you know, up to the power of attorney piece, I would need to do a little more research on, just because, you know, every different scenario, to be perfectly honest, has not been covered in all of the Q&A sessions or webinars we've attached or attended, even as financial aid professionals. But the bottom line, you know, what I'm hearing over and over and over again about being a FAFSA contributor is that it's truly who is financially contributing the most. And if that's really, you know, 50 cents more on one side than the other, that is really what the federal government is looking for. That is my understanding. So I think, as a lot of, one thing I didn't touch on during this webinar that is helpful to know, the FAFSA, just like we said, is always, it's using what you call your prior tax year information. So in this case, for the 24-25 application, we're going back to the 2022 tax year, and you will import that information. And one thing that is not changing for sure, and in financial aid offices, we always have the opportunity to work with families on what we call like special circumstances appeals. So, there, for any variety of reasons, a student or a family, whether a family went through a divorce or a job loss, there may be a situation where the tax information that's on your 2022 taxes is just not accurately representing what's going on in your household anymore. And if that's the case, we always strongly encourage you to reach out to the financial aid office, where you're applying to. And the reason we say that is you as an individual, you can't override that information on your FAFSA, like the student can't do that. But we as financial aid administrators, if we have the appropriate documentation, we can go in that, we can, collect that special circumstances appeal and update the FAFSA manually behind the scenes to potentially get a student additional financial aid, through that process. So when you have a very, very specific, maybe a little bit unusual situation that you're dealing with, we always encourage you to reach out to the financial aid office at the school that you've applied to discuss that. And they may even, they might not have the answer right off the bat. They probably will have to do a little research as well, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised to just find that there are lots of professionals out there ready, willing, and happy to help you with, really tapping in and getting you, the most generous aid package that we can.
Angela, one of the new things I know in the past that you could only apply, or you could only put 20 schools on the FAFSA. Did I hear somewhere where they've removed that and now you can put more than 20 schools?
I touched on it briefly. In the past, you could only put 10 schools, and
Or
they
10. Okay,
they updated it to 20 this year. So
okay,
so that's absolutely right. So, but they did expand it. It can be up to 20.
Up to 20. Okay, great.
And if for some reason you're looking at more than 20 schools, just for your own purposes behind the scenes, this is what we always advise students in the past. You can put those first 20 on there, send it out, and then you can do a correction to your FAFSA and remove, if you had 2 more you needed to add, you can remove 2 of the schools, add 2 new ones, and resend it out. By removing the other schools, it's not like it's going to take that data back from them. Once they have your FAFSA in their database, they're going to have it. It's not going to, they won't even know that you removed them and resent it, but there's always that workaround too.
Great, thank you.
Can I just recap a couple of questions if
Sure.
anyone is watching later? So if you missed at the beginning, yes, we are recording this and it will be put on our website. There was a question, does only the student create the FSA ID or does the contributor also create? Yes, the student needs their own FSA ID. If you have more than one student in college, each student needs their own, and the contributor also needs their own ID. And there was a question, at what age does your parents' income no longer need to be disclosed? This is what is called an independent student. And typically there's only certain circumstances that would qualify you to only disclose your own income. It is if you're at least 24, or if you are married, if you're in active duty in the armed forces, if you are a ward of the court or an emancipated minor. There's a couple more instances, but really those are the main things. There was a new question I saw, which I thought was pretty good. They say FAFSA is first come, first serve. And what does that mean if it's true? And what is, from our experience, what level of household income, at what level does FAFSA diminish, I guess?
Sure. So to address the first question, in some cases, yes, FAFSA can be first come, first serve. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. When we say that, there can be certain pools of funding that a university receives that once that funding is spent, it's just gone. But what I can say from my experience, that the vast majority of funding that the universities and colleges are processing is not first come, first serve. So when we're talking about like a Washington College grant, a federal Pell grant, all of the different loans and a variety of different financial aid, essentially, if you qualify for it, that university will process it for you, and it's an unlimited amount. But it is important to get your FAFSA done as early as possible, because for instance, there are some mostly federal grants called like a supplemental grant that each school just gets an allotment of each year. So Seattle U, for instance, and most colleges will have a priority funding date, and that's just how they go about, trying to be as equitable as you can to get that out to as many students in need as we can. And then once that funding is just exhausted, then, if we have one student who applied on January 1st and someone who didn't apply all the way till September 1st or something like that, clearly the student who really was lagging behind and just applied before they were starting at university, they may risk the chance of not getting all of the funding. So I hope that addresses that. The other question about like what level of income would a student or family need to have where the FAFSA would no longer be like helpful or viable? There is not a one size fits all answer to that. And that's why I highlight again and again, we strongly encourage all students and families to complete the FAFSA application. You may, if you do it your freshman year and you come to the point where you see that, okay, I did the FAFSA application, I did not qualify for any kind of need-based financial aid, and as a family, we're not interested in tapping into federal loans, then it is possible that you would make the choice not to reapply during your sophomore, junior, senior year. But we always just really strongly encourage everyone to do it their freshman year at the very least, because there is a good chance that you may qualify for some funding that you didn't anticipate. At the very least, all students and families, if you complete the FAFSA, would qualify for a federal loan at the very least. Again, it's up to each family to decide, whether that's something that they want to utilize or not. But that is always our advice.
That's something that I heard that as well, that I've been in a couple conferences where those very, very expensive universities are saying that they have raised and they're continuing to raise the parent, how much a parent makes. So I think some of them are up to almost $200,000 a year. So people always think, like you were saying, I'm not going to do this because I won't qualify. But a lot of universities are raising those limits. And so that's for some of their endowment monies and things like that. So again, I think we would all encourage families to fill out that FAFSA form, because you don't know. There's so many different pots to draw from.
No, there are, and it's a more complicated algorithm behind the scenes, that there's so many different factors that go into that determination, both institutionally as well as through the federal methodology used on the FAFSA. So that's why we always encourage that.
a couple people asked the same question. They wanted to know after they submit their FAFSA, kind of what happens and when might they hear
Sure.
how that all works behind the scenes afterwards.
Good question. And normally we touch on that a little bit more, and the basic nuts and bolts will absolutely be the same as usual. The time frame is a little bit different because we are waiting on the federal government. You know, they have released the information saying that as of December 31st, it will be available for families to apply to. They have not released information to financial aid offices, letting us know when it's going to be available for us to start downloading the information. It's just such a unique year that we are, you know, I know us and every other university across the country are just working to pivot and move as quickly as we can. What I can tell you, though, that generally what will happen is clearly you can apply for your FAFSA and apply for admissions at the same time. So clearly connect with your admissions offices, you know, do all of the tours and do all the questions and do everything with those admissions counselors, you know, on your regular time frame. Essentially, the way it works in our office is once a student is officially accepted at a university, we work very closely with our admissions offices, and essentially what will happen is that, you know, we'll get a green light in our office that the student has been accepted, and, you know, at which point when FAFSAs are available and we have them downloaded, we will start the review process. And, you know, we work very closely in tandem with admissions, and this is the same at every other university, that admissions makes the determination about merit-based financial aid. So that's scholarships and so on that have no need-based component. It's purely based on the student's merit and their admissions application. Admissions communicates that to our office, and then what our office is doing is looking at the FAFSA or WASFA to determine need-based financial aid, and our office is the one in the end that pulls that whole financial aid offer together. And once it's available, we, you know, every university will do it a little different. Most universities will probably be sending you a paper letter, definitely electronic communication. We still do both at this point, or at least we have historically. This year, we'll see if it's a little bit different, just because I know we're already going to be, I'm not saying behind, because every other university is going to be in the same exact boat that we are, but we know that everyone is going to be anxious to be getting that information. So I think the final determination of how and how quickly we can get that into your hands is what we'll do. When you get that financial aid offer, we try to make it as transparent as we can, in the sense that we'll send you that whole cost of attendance kind of that we discussed. And at Seattle U, we send the offer listing all the different financial aid. And then we also, which we've gotten some compliments on, we send out what we call an out-of-pocket cost worksheet. So it has your cost of attendance, it has your financial aid, and then we minus that all out to really try to make it as easy as we can to give you that bottom line, to show you what the cost would be out of pocket, or what you would still need to pay directly or through a Parent Plus loan, or all those different options we talked about earlier. So those are the steps that you would expect to see after you're accepted, and after you've completed your FAFSA, and then finally after we have your FAFSA in our office as well.
Angela, I have two good questions, and I'll ask them one at a time. The first one I'm seeing, what's the major difference between FAFSA and CSS profile? And do you have to fill out both, or just the FAFSA?
Good question. So that is it depends answer. So the FAFSA is a federal aid application. The CSS profile is an optional application that some universities use to help administer their financial aid. So that will completely depend on the universities that you're looking at. For instance, Seattle U, we're purely a federal aid school that uses federal methodology. We do not use the CSS profile. Essentially, the CSS profile has all the same information as the FAFSA, but it goes in more depth, in my experience with like your assets and different information, where it just gets a little bit more into your business about what kind of assets and income and so on and so forth you have that those schools choose to collect, in the end, to be as equitable as they can with the funding that they have. So it just really, FAFSA is almost 9 times out of 10, you definitely need to do that. CSS profile is just dependent on the schools that you're applying for. And if you had any questions, whether it was required or not, you just want to reach out to that university and ask them if they use that.
Perfect. The other question I'm seeing, and it really is the big question of the night. I know as counselors, we have our own perspective. I would love to maybe hear some of your thoughts on how long it will take to hear back about FAFSA. It's such a chaotic year. Is this going to interfere with dates that students have to say whether they're going a certain school?
The truth is every single university is in the same boat. And I wish I could give you a concrete answer to that question. What I can say is I know every university is going to be working as quickly as they can to get this turned around and out to students. What I can also say, like if for some reason the Department of Ed, if there's really a huge delay on their end, then I can't imagine universities not banding together and saying, hey, it's impossible because we don't have the data to make these decisions, that it would be like a universal decision to push everything back. Don't quote me on that. I mean, clearly that hasn't been like a decision made, but I think it is just common sense that like everyone is getting as prepared as they can. But it's not like some schools will have the capability to get things sooner and then have an upper hand. It's really that everyone is going to get this information at the same time. So I think worst case scenario, you just want to, stay in communication with your schools and universities. I know we do a good job of communicating with our students, and like as soon as we know anything, we really do our best to share that with the community. So, and I think every other university is going to do the same. So I while I can appreciate being anxious about it, I think in the end, it should all work out. I know it might be a little bit more hectic. It is for us too, but I really don't think in the end that it's going to, I don't think families will be put in a position where one school is going to be pressuring to say, hey, you have to tell us by May 1st when you haven't even heard from another school. I could be wrong, but I don't anticipate that happening.
Checking to see if there's any more questions coming in. Does anybody have any more questions before we end the evening? We're not seeing
I
any.
am seeing a couple of lingering questions in the Q&A that maybe we've already answered. For the contributor, you really are picking the parent or guardian or contributor that is more financially able to help.
That is absolutely true. That is very clear in all the guidance that we've received, that is what they're looking for.
I think the others, there is one, and I think we've really actually already covered this because we encourage everybody to fill out at least the FAFSA, because you don't know. Somebody had written that they had heard that if you're unsure about it, whether you qualify for need-based, you shouldn't apply, since it will negatively influence your admissions. But the colleges don't see any of this right away anyway. So
no, that would not be, what I would suggest. So
if I don't want to fill out the CSS application, but I'm able to do the FAFSA. Will that mess with schools that I said we won't apply for financial aid?
So that would be a question to reach out directly to a CSS profile school. I don't want to give you any misinformation. Like I said, I've worked in financial aid for like very close. I think I'm like 19 and a half years now, very close to 20 years, but I've never worked at a CSS profile school. So that I just would say is not that I have a good understanding of how it works. And I think if you are seriously interested in a school that uses a CSS profile, you need to do that. At least that's my understanding. But if there was any gray area or way to work around that, then reaching out to that school would be my advice.
One last question we have. We had a FAFSA account from a prior child. Do we need to create a new one?
So the FSA ID, you will want to go in to renew it essentially. You may find that, you know, the information is still in there already, but each separate parent and each student needs their own. So I think by going to that website and just confirming that the ones you have from your previous child are active, they should be. And then, you know, while you're doing that, you can get that new one set up for your newly enrolling
child.
student. Mm-hmm.
Right. Is there anything else? Doesn't look like it. Angela, we can't. Did you have another one, Molly? I'm seeing. Did you?
I just wanted to say, if you have any questions that pop up later, or if you're watching this at a later time, please get in touch with myself or Susie and we can answer your questions when we receive them. And I wanted to say thank you, Angela, for coming.
Yes, that's Angela. It's been such a joy to work with you over the last few years, and you always bring such great, first of all, energy, but also you really have some great knowledge that I think our families can really benefit from. So thank you.
I appreciate that. You guys are always a pleasure to work with too, and it's my pleasure to be here this evening. So I think I had mentioned to